I still remember the exact moment the room went silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any words ever spoken, the kind that makes your chest tighten before your mind even understands why. And if you've ever been in a place where everything looks perfect on the surface but something underneath feels wrong, then you'll understand what I'm about to say, because that night didn't start with fear, it started with a smile, with polished silverware reflecting warm yellow light, with a long oak table set for 8 with soft music playing from a speaker in the corner, the kind of evening that should have felt safe, normal, even comforting. And yet from the moment I stepped into Daniel's parents' house, something in me hesitated, just for a second, like my body recognized a truth my mind wasn't ready to face. My name is Emma Carter, I'm 34 years old, and at that time I believed I understood my marriage. I believed I understood my husband, and I definitely believed I understood the family I had married into. But I was wrong, completely wrong, because what looks like stability from the outside can sometimes be carefully maintained silence on the inside. And that night, as I took my seat at the table, I noticed the small things first, the way Daniel barely looked at me when I sat down, the way his mother, Margaret, offered me a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the way his father kept his focus on his plate like routine mattered more than presence. Everything felt rehearsed, controlled, like everyone already knew their role in something I hadn't been told about. And I told myself I was overthinking, that maybe I was just tired, that maybe this was what family dinners were supposed to feel like after a few years of marriage, quiet, predictable, uneventful. But then Daniel spoke, and it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, sharp, dismissive, like I had somehow already done something wrong without realizing it, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that had been showing up more often lately, the one I kept ignoring because it was easier to believe things would get better than to question why they weren't. I glanced around the table, waiting for someone to react, to shift the energy, to soften the moment, but no one did, not his father, not his sister, and especially not Margaret, who simply continued cutting her food with slow, precise movements, like she had seen this scene before, like she knew exactly how it would unfold. And that's when something inside me started to change, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet realization forming beneath the surface, the kind that creeps in slowly, telling you that maybe this isn't new. Maybe you just haven't been paying attention. And as the conversation moved on, as forks clinked against plates and glasses were lifted like everything was fine, I realized the most unsettling part wasn't what was happening. It was the fact that no one seemed surprised, like this was just another ordinary night, and I was the only one still expecting it to be different. And that was the moment I should have understood, the moment I should have listened to that instinct telling me something wasn't right, because what happened next didn't come out of nowhere, it came from a pattern I hadn't fully seen yet. A pattern that had been sitting quietly at that table long before I ever took my seat. Daniel leaned back in his chair like nothing unusual had happened, like the tension in the air was just another background detail that did not deserve attention. And he picked up his glass slowly, taking a sip of water before glancing at me again with that same distant expression, the one that made me feel like I was no longer part of the room but something placed inside it. Something to be observed or corrected rather than understood, and I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself to stay calm, to not overreact, because that was what I had learned to do over time, to smooth things over, to keep the peace, even when something inside me felt unsettled. And I forced a small smile, reaching for my fork as if continuing the meal would somehow reset everything. But the silence did not break, it stretched, heavy and deliberate, until Daniel spoke again, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet, asking why I had not responded earlier when his sister mentioned the trip next month. And I blinked for a moment, confused, trying to recall the exact moment he was referring to, because I had been listening, I knew I had, but before I could answer, he shook his head slightly, like my silence had already confirmed something negative in his mind, and I felt that familiar pressure building in my chest, the need to explain myself even when I was not sure what I had done wrong. I started to speak, carefully choosing my words, saying that I thought she was asking him, not me, but he interrupted before I could finish, letting out a quiet breath that sounded more like disappointment than anger. And that somehow felt worse because it made me feel small, like I was constantly failing in ways I could not fully see. I glanced at Margaret then, just for a second, hoping for something, a shift, a distraction, anything that would ease the moment, but she did not look at me directly. Her eyes remained on her plate, though I noticed the slight pause in her movement, the way her fork hovered for a second longer than necessary before touching the food again. And it was subtle, so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but it told me she was aware, fully aware. And yet she said nothing, no one did. The conversation slowly resumed around me, Daniel's sister talking about hotel reservations, his father asking about traffic earlier that day, voices overlapping in a way that should have felt normal, but instead it felt like I had been quietly removed from the scene, like I was sitting just outside of it, watching it continue without me. And that was when the realization grew stronger, clearer. This was not about one comment or one moment, this was a pattern, something that had been happening in pieces, in small, almost invisible ways, moments where I felt corrected, dismissed, or quietly undermined, and I had been collecting them without fully acknowledging what they meant, because each one on its own seemed too small to confront, too easy to explain away, but together they formed something heavier, something undeniable, and as I sat there, holding my fork without taking another bite, I felt a question rise in my mind that I could not ignore anymore, not after tonight, not after the way everyone had responded, or rather the way they had chosen not to respond. And the question was simple but unsettling: how long had this been happening, and more importantly, how long had I been convincing myself that it was normal? The sound of silverware against plates continued like nothing had changed, steady and almost rhythmic, but inside me everything felt slightly off, like a picture that had been tilted just enough to make you uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. And I realized I had not taken a single bite in the last few minutes, my hand still resting near my plate as if I had forgotten what I was supposed to do next. And that was when Daniel looked at me again, this time longer, more directly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as if he was studying something about me that did not meet his expectations, and he asked, in a tone that sounded casual on the surface but carried something sharper underneath, why I was just sitting there and not eating. And for a second I hesitated, not because I did not have an answer, but because I suddenly felt like any answer I gave would be wrong, like I was stepping into a conversation where the outcome had already been decided. And I said quietly that I just was not very hungry, trying to keep my voice even, trying to keep the moment small, but he let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between that made my chest tighten again. And he said that I should at least try, that his mother had spent hours preparing dinner. And there it was, that subtle shift, the one that turned something simple into something heavier, because now it was not just about me not eating, it was about me being ungrateful, inconsiderate, disrespectful, and I felt the weight of those unspoken words settle around me. Even though no one said them directly, I could feel them in the way his sister glanced at me briefly before looking away, in the way his father adjusted in his chair without speaking, in the way Margaret finally lifted her eyes for just a second, meeting mine, and in that brief moment there was something there, something I could not fully name, not judgment, not exactly, but not support either. It was more like recognition, like she understood the situation but had already decided not to intervene, and that realization hit me harder than anything else because it meant this was expected, this was known, this was allowed, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air thicker, and I became very aware of every detail, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, the ticking clock on the wall counting each second too loudly, the way the overhead light cast soft shadows across the table. Everything felt too clear, too sharp, as if my mind was trying to capture the moment before something shifted again. And then Daniel leaned slightly forward, placing his hand flat on the table, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention, and he said my name, Emma, in a tone that was calm but firm, the kind of tone that does not ask for a response but expects compliance, and I felt my heartbeat quicken, not because of what he had done, but because of what I sensed was coming, that quiet escalation that had been building all evening, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to, waiting, not for something loud or obvious, but for something subtle, something that would once again be easy to dismiss if I chose to. And that was the moment I understood the real conflict was no longer just between Daniel and me, it was between what I was experiencing and what everyone else was pretending not to see, and I did not know which one was more dangerous, the behavior itself or the silence that protected it. Daniel did not raise his voice, and somehow that made everything feel more controlled, more intentional, like every word he chose had already been measured before it left his mouth, and he kept his hand resting on the table as he looked at me, waiting, not for an explanation but for agreement, for correction, for me to adjust myself to whatever standard he had already decided I had failed to meet, and I felt my throat tighten slightly as I tried to find the right words, the safe words, the ones that would not make things worse, because by now I understood that there were always consequences, not loud ones, not obvious ones, but subtle shifts that would follow me long after the moment passed, changes in tone, in attitude, in the way I would be treated for the rest of the evening, maybe even longer, and I said quietly that I did not mean to offend anyone, that I appreciated the dinner, that I just was not feeling very well, and for a second I thought that might be enough, that maybe the moment would pass, that maybe the tension would dissolve back into polite conversation. But Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, and asked what exactly was wrong with me, and it was not concern, not really, it was something else, something closer to evaluation, like he was testing the validity of my answer, deciding whether it was acceptable or not, and I hesitated again because I did not have a clear answer, because the truth was not something I could easily say out loud, that I felt uncomfortable, that I felt watched, that I felt like I was constantly being measured against expectations I did not fully understand. So instead I repeated that I was just tired, hoping that would be simple enough, neutral enough, but he leaned back slightly, letting out another quiet breath, and for a moment he did not say anything, and that silence stretched just long enough to make me feel exposed, like everyone at the table was now waiting to see how he would respond, not how I felt, not what I needed, but what he would decide next. And I noticed his sister stop mid-sentence, her fork paused halfway to her mouth, his father shifting slightly in his seat, not looking up but clearly aware, and Margaret, still composed, still quiet, her posture unchanged, but her eyes no longer on her plate, now resting somewhere between us, not fully meeting mine, not fully avoiding them either, and I felt something inside me start to shake, not visibly, but internally, like a fragile structure finally reaching its limit. And Daniel finally spoke again, saying that being tired was not an excuse to be disrespectful in his parents' home. And the word disrespectful echoed in my mind louder than anything else, because it reframed everything, turned my quiet discomfort into wrongdoing, turned my silence into failure. And I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to explain that I was not trying to be disrespectful, that I was just trying to get through the evening without making things worse. But the words felt heavy, slow, like they had to push through something before they could come out, and before I could finish forming a sentence he made a small gesture with his hand, not sudden, not forceful, just a subtle movement that carried more weight than it should have, and I flinched slightly, not because of the gesture itself, but because of what it represented, that underlying tension, that unspoken expectation of control, and the room reacted in the same way it had all night, by not reacting at all. No one spoke, no one intervened, no one even looked surprised. And that was when it hit me fully, clearly. This was not a moment that had gone wrong, this was a system that was working exactly as it always had, and I was the only one still hoping it could be different. For a few seconds no one moved, and it was not the kind of pause that happens naturally in conversation. It was something heavier, something intentional, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to correct myself, to shrink just enough to make everything feel normal again. And I realized then that this was the expectation, not spoken out loud but understood by everyone at that table, that I would adjust, that I would smooth things over, that I would carry the discomfort quietly so no one else had to acknowledge it. And I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of my plate, grounding myself in something physical because everything else felt uncertain. And Daniel leaned back again. His posture relaxed now, almost satisfied, like the moment had already resolved in his mind, like there was nothing left to discuss. And that shift, that calmness after tension, unsettled me more than anything else, because it suggested that this pattern was familiar to him, predictable, something he had seen play out before. And I glanced at Margaret again, this time longer, searching for something in her expression, something that might tell me I was not imagining this, that this was not just in my head. And for a brief second our eyes met fully, and in that moment I saw it, not clearly, not completely, but enough to recognize it, a flicker of something that looked like regret or maybe memory, something old and buried that surfaced just long enough to be noticed before it disappeared again behind her composed expression. And she lowered her gaze almost immediately, returning her attention to her plate as if nothing had happened, and that small interaction, that almost invisible exchange, stayed with me, because it felt like a message without words, something being communicated quietly beneath the surface. And the conversation around the table resumed again, louder this time, more deliberate, as if everyone was trying to fill the space that had just been created. Daniel's sister talking about restaurant reservations in a bright tone that did not match the tension from moments ago. His father asking a question about work that no one seemed particularly interested in answering, and I realized that this was how it worked. This was how everything stayed intact, not by addressing what happened, but by covering it with something else, something easier, something safer. And I sat there, listening to voices that no longer felt connected to me, feeling like I was observing a performance that I had unknowingly been cast in. And the more I paid attention, the more I noticed the details I had ignored before, the way Daniel occasionally glanced at me, not to check on me, but to confirm that I was behaving as expected, The way his sister avoided direct eye contact whenever the tension returned, the way Margaret remained quiet no matter what, her silence steady, consistent, almost practiced, and a thought began to form, slow but undeniable. This was not about one dinner. This was not about one comment. This was something that had been built over time, something reinforced by silence, by acceptance, by repetition. And I felt a shift inside me, not loud, not dramatic, but firm, like a line being drawn somewhere deep within. Because for the first time I was not just reacting to the moment, I was seeing the pattern. And once you see something like that clearly, you cannot unsee it, no matter how much everyone else pretends it is not there. And as I sat there, surrounded by voices that continued as if nothing had happened, I realized the most unsettling truth of all, the hardest one to accept, was not what Daniel had said or done, it was the fact that this entire room had already decided that it was normal, and if I stayed silent like they did, then eventually I would become part of that silence too. The more I sat there, the more that quiet realization settled into something heavier, something I could no longer ignore or explain away, and it felt like I was standing at the edge of a truth I had been avoiding for a long time, one that had been showing itself in small moments, in subtle patterns, in things that never seemed serious enough on their own but together formed something undeniable, and I could feel my heartbeat steadying now, not because I was calmer, but because something inside me was shifting from confusion to clarity, and that clarity brought a different kind of tension, the kind that comes when you realize you have been seeing things all along but choosing not to name them. And I glanced at Margaret again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, because that brief moment earlier, that flicker in her eyes, had stayed with me, and I needed to understand it, even if only in a small way. And as the conversation around us continued in that same forced rhythm, I noticed her hand resting near the edge of the table, fingers slightly curled, unmoving, like she was holding herself still. And there was something about that stillness that felt familiar, not to me but to her, like it was something she had practiced over time, something she had learned to do without thinking. And then, slowly, almost carefully, she leaned just slightly in my direction, not enough for anyone else to notice, not enough to interrupt the flow of conversation, just enough to close the space between us by a few inches, and her voice came low, so quiet that it barely rose above the sound of dishes and distant voices, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. But then I heard it clearly, soft, controlled, and weighted with something that did not belong to this moment alone. She said that she had stayed, and there was a pause, a brief hesitation that carried more meaning than the words themselves, and then she added, "Do not be like me," and the words did not feel dramatic, they were not spoken with urgency or fear, but that made them more powerful, because they sounded like something that had been carried for years, something that had settled deep enough to become quiet. And I felt my breath catch slightly as I processed what she had just said, because it was not advice in the usual sense, it was not comfort, it was not even direct support. It was something more complicated, something that acknowledged the situation without challenging it, something that revealed a truth without exposing it, and I turned my head just enough to look at her, really look at her this time, and for a brief second she met my eyes again, and this time there was no ambiguity, no distance, just a clear, unspoken understanding. And then just as quickly, she straightened back in her chair, returning to her place at the table, her expression composed, her movements calm, as if nothing had happened at all, and the conversation continued around us uninterrupted, untouched, like her words had never been spoken. But inside me everything had changed, because in that single moment she had confirmed what I had been starting to see, that this was not new, that this was not isolated, that this had existed long before I arrived. And that realization carried a weight I could not ignore anymore, because it meant that staying silent would not protect me. It would only make me part of something that had already been passed down, something that had already shaped the people sitting at this table. And as I sat there, hearing her words echo quietly in my mind, I realized that what she had given me was not just a warning, it was a choice, one she had not made for herself, but one she was placing in front of me now. And for the first time that night, I understood that what happened next would not be about them, it would be about me. Her words did not fade, they stayed, repeating quietly in my mind even as the conversation around the table continued like nothing had shifted, and I found myself no longer listening to what anyone was saying, no longer trying to follow the flow of polite discussion, because something deeper had taken hold of my attention, something that demanded to be understood, and I began to see things differently, not just what was happening in that moment, but everything that had led to it, every small instance I had dismissed, every time I had told myself it was not serious, every moment I had chosen comfort over clarity, and suddenly those memories aligned in a way they never had before, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. And I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, not as my husband, not as the person I had built a life with, but as part of this system, part of something that existed before me, something shaped by years of behavior that had been accepted, reinforced, and never questioned. And I noticed the way he spoke to his sister, slightly dismissive but still within boundaries, the way he addressed his father with a controlled respect, and then the way he looked at me, different, more critical, more demanding, as if I existed in a separate category entirely. And that realization settled heavily in my chest, because it meant this was not random, it was intentional, learned, repeated. And I turned my attention back to Margaret, her posture still perfect, her expression calm, but now I could see the layers beneath it, the restraint, the silence that was not natural but practiced, the kind that comes from years of choosing not to react. And I wondered how many times she had sat in that same chair, in that same position, hearing similar words, feeling similar tension, and deciding each time to let it pass, to keep the peace, to stay. And I felt a sudden wave of clarity that was almost overwhelming, because it connected everything, her words, his behavior, the silence of the room. It was all part of the same cycle, one that did not need to be enforced loudly because it was already understood by everyone involved. And I realized then that this was not just about what had happened tonight, it was about what would continue to happen if nothing changed, if I stayed, if I adapted, if I allowed myself to become quieter, smaller, more careful with every word, every action, until eventually I would no longer recognize the person I had been before all of this. And that thought was more frightening than anything else, not the tension, not the discomfort, but the idea of slowly losing myself without even realizing it. And as that understanding settled in, something inside me shifted again, this time more firmly, more clearly, like a decision forming before it had fully reached the surface. And I noticed my hands were no longer tense, my breathing more steady, not because the situation had improved, but because I was no longer trying to make sense of it in the same way. I was no longer asking whether it was normal. I was asking whether it was acceptable, and that question changed everything because the answer for the first time was clear. And as I sat there, surrounded by a conversation that continued as if nothing had happened, I realized that what came next would not be determined by them. It would be determined by whether I was willing to break something that had been left unbroken for far too long. The decision did not arrive as a sudden burst of courage or a dramatic realization. It came quietly, almost calmly, settling into me with a certainty I had never felt before. And for the first time that night, I was not reacting to what was happening around me. I was choosing how I would respond to it. And that difference changed everything because instead of shrinking into the moment, I straightened slightly in my chair. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in a way that felt grounded, deliberate, and I placed my fork down gently on the plate. The soft sound barely noticeable yet somehow louder to me than anything else in the room. And I realized my hands were steady, my breathing even, as if my body had finally caught up with the clarity in my mind. And Daniel noticed the shift immediately, his eyes moving toward me again, this time with a subtle hint of curiosity, like he was trying to understand what had changed. And I met his gaze without hesitation, without the usual instinct to soften or avoid, and for a brief moment the noise around the table seemed to fade, not completely, but enough that I could focus on what mattered. And I spoke, my voice calm, measured, but firm in a way it had not been before. And I said his name, Daniel, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly enough that it interrupted the flow of conversation. And that alone was enough to make the table quiet again, not because I had raised my voice, but because I had stepped outside the role they expected me to play. And I continued, choosing my words carefully, not to provoke, not to escalate, but to state something simple and undeniable, that I did not feel comfortable, that the way I had been spoken to was not something I could ignore anymore. And as I spoke, I noticed the immediate reactions around me. His sister froze mid-motion, his father finally looked up, his expression unreadable but attentive, and Margaret, for the first time that night, did not look away, her eyes fixed on me with a stillness that felt different, almost searching. And Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that this was not the response he had anticipated. And he leaned forward just a fraction, as if preparing to respond, but I did not stop, because I knew that if I paused, the moment might slip away, might be redirected, reshaped into something smaller, easier to dismiss. And I said that I understood everyone had expectations, that I respected the effort that went into the evening, but respect could not exist in only one direction. And as the words left my mouth, I felt something release inside me, something that had been held back for far too long, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not heavy with avoidance, it was filled with attention, with awareness, and I realized that this was the break, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because for the first time the pattern had been interrupted, and as I looked around the table, I saw it in their faces, the shift, the discomfort, the uncertainty of what would come next, and I knew that whatever happened after this, it would not be the same as before, because I had made a choice not just to speak, but to no longer be part of the silence that had defined this room for so long. No one spoke immediately after I finished, and that silence felt different from all the others that had come before. It was not empty or dismissive, it was filled with something shifting, something unsettled, like the balance in the room had been quietly disrupted and no one quite knew how to restore it. And Daniel was the first to react, though not in the way I had expected. He did not raise his voice or argue. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, as if he was seeing a version of me he did not recognize, and that alone told me how much I had changed in that moment, because I had stepped outside the role he had grown comfortable with, and he asked slowly what I meant by that, his tone controlled but edged with something uncertain, and for the first time I did not feel the need to soften my answer. I did not rush to reassure him or explain myself in a way that would make things easier. I simply repeated that I could not continue pretending everything was fine when it was not, and I could feel the weight of those words settle into the room, not as confrontation but as truth, and his sister shifted uncomfortably in her seat. His father cleared his throat but said nothing, and Margaret, still watching me, held my gaze for a second longer than before, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there earlier, something closer to recognition, maybe even relief, though she did not speak, and I realized that her silence had changed too. It was no longer avoidance, it was something else, something that felt like witnessing, and Daniel leaned back again, his posture less certain than before, and I could see him trying to regain control of the situation, trying to return things to the way they had been, but something had already shifted beyond that point, and I slowly pushed my chair back, the soft sound against the floor marking the end of something I had not fully understood until now, and I stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with a quiet finality that felt stronger than any raised voice could have been, and I said that I was going to leave, not because I wanted to create a scene, but because I finally understood that staying in that moment, in that pattern, was a choice I did not want to make anymore. And no one stopped me, not Daniel, not his father, not his sister, and that silence this time felt like acceptance, not agreement, but acknowledgement that something real had happened, and as I turned to leave I hesitated just for a second, not out of doubt, but because I felt Margaret's presence again, and when I looked back she was still sitting there, her hands resting quietly on the table, her posture unchanged, but her eyes softer, and she gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but enough to say that she understood, enough to say that I had done something she had not, and I stepped outside into the cool night air, the quiet of the street wrapping around me in